So in my previous job, I sort of fulfilled the role of the day-to-day operations, processing, customer service, sales, all of that stuff as the location manager. We were a pretty small location, had a pretty small staff, but I was responsible for hiring a lot of those staff members. Now, the hiring process and how it comes together is going to be unique to each company, each industry, and there's no one size fits all sort of thing. And because I was, a small cog in this larger corporation, I didn't have a lot of control about where job ads were placed and what sort of language and sort of skills. We call it KSAs in human resources, so knowledge, skills, and attributes. I didn't have much control over that, but when a job was posted, I would get forwarded all of the resumes and cover letters and contact information for all of the applicants. And I would do an initial screening just based on the resumes, if they met the base requirements, and if I thought, okay, I can probably work with this person, or okay, they have a bit of experience in this area. So maybe they had some experience with computers, but not with sales. I would maybe read through their cover letter or pull them in for an interview just to see if they can meet some of the sales components or if they have some of the other components that we're looking for. It's just kind of figuring out what candidates are going to work. Now, one of the things in HR planning is meeting that supply of labor with your demand for labor. And my location was in a small city in Eastern Canada, and it had, at the time, I don't know if it still does, but it had the highest unemployment rate of any city in the country. So it appeared like there was a surplus in available staff. And when we would post a position, I would get 60 resumes in the first week. And then when I would try and call people for interviews, there was one time when I was hiring for a position, I scheduled 12 interviews, and of those 12, 3 showed up. So, and that was, of about 60 applicants, I did the initial screening, chose 12 to interview, and only 3 showed up. Now, there were a lot of reasons for this. I can just get into kind of why I thought our job was, we're outside of the city. We weren't directly in town. So if someone didn't have a vehicle or means of transport, they had to take the bus. And the bus route was not a great bus route. I think the bus only came 2 or 3 times a day. So if your shift didn't line up with when the bus was there, that was a struggle. And we were, on certain days of the week, we were on like 3 shifts or 2.5 shifts, I guess. We weren't open 24/7, but close to it some days. And it wasn't a good fit for a lot of people. So they would apply to meet their requirements to apply to places, but then, they were really interested in the position. So that was a struggle, to just get people to come in for interviews. And then the interview process itself, sorry, my cat's trying to get the dog to play. The interview process itself, again, it's going to vary. I don't know if you would have seen in the past, bits about the interview process where they ask you very philosophical questions that make no sense, like, if you were a tree, what sort of tree would you be? It's like, what's that supposed to tell you? Or the classic, what's your biggest weakness? Where you then say, oh, well, I'm a perfectionist, or something that isn't a negative isn't actually a weakness. It's a positive that you've spun. But the interviewing that I did, we used situational interview questions, which is becoming even more common. I think it's quite popular at most places now. But it focused on, having the applicant tell me a story. So I remember one of the questions was, can you tell me about a time that you had a conflict with a coworker or a supervisor and how you dealt with that? So the applicant would tell me about the interaction, and from the story they would tell me, I would get some insight on their interpersonal skills, their conflict resolution, their past work experiences, and maybe a bit of detail on the culture or what sort of management style they've worked under before that didn't work, and build off that as a question. And my goal was always to keep the interview very simple, so I would only ever ask like 3 questions about those stories and have it be conversational. When conversations are like a quiz, or interviews are like a quiz, you don't get into some of those other elements that are really important when you're going to make those decisions for hiring. So then, as an interviewee, if I was to go into those situations, you would want, it's a tricky balance, because you want the job, because you want to get that check and all of that, but you also want to be honest, because the information that you're providing to them is going to also tell you something about the business, and about how they operate. And at the end of every interview, there's always do you have any questions for us? And that's really a good time to ask questions like, what's the culture like? How do you value your employees? What is a perfect example, at my work, if there were storm days, what are your expectations regarding getting to shifts if there's a storm? Or it was at an airport, so if flights are delayed past closing time, expectations, working alone, those sorts of interactions and things are always valuable to ask at the interview process, so that not only are the hiring people making a decision, but you're also making the decision as an potential employee of, do I actually even want to work here? I've had people come in, interview, when we talk about the job and sort of the roles and responsibilities. At the end of the interview, I say, okay, do you have any questions for me? Okay, moving forward, is this something that you would be interested in pursuing and pushing towards the next stage? And I've had people say, you know what, no, I don't think it's a good fit. And I'd say, thank you for telling me. And usually by that point I already knew that it wasn't a good fit, but it's always good to be self-aware and be able to make those decisions for yourself. And personally, after the interview is when I call and check references. Some people will check references before they call in for an interview, but I like to call the references after I've met the person. And sometimes I do a phone interview, check references, and then bring them in for a face-to-face interview. It really depended on the position. If I was hiring for a casual or part-time position, I would just skip to the in-person interview. But if it was for a sales position or a full-time position, I'd do a 2-step interview. Anyway, once the interview's done, coming to the point of selecting the potential staff member, bigger institutions might have selection criteria requirements or scoring requirements that are met. So if you're wanting to hire someone, they might take a general knowledge quiz where they have to, complete with a minimum score of X, or take a personality quiz where they, have a certain personality area that they fall into. It really just kind of depends on the company and what their expectations are and what policies they put in place. For example, Dalhousie has something called equity, diversity, and inclusion hiring. And that is used when there are two candidates that both meet the minimum requirements for a job, minimum qualifications. If they're equivalent to, or if they both meet the minimum, then the position will go to the person who would be the EDI candidate. So that would be from an underrepresented group or disadvantaged group. Now, the key word there is they have to be meeting the base minimum requirement. So if in the job ad you said the minimum requirement is a 4-year bachelor degree with 3 years of experience, and you had a candidate who is not an EDI individual, who had a master's degree and 5 years of experience, so exceeded the base qualifications, but then you had someone who hit multiple categories of EDI and the base requirements but had less experience, the EDI candidate would be selected. And that's a policy that the institution has and that they have set for themselves. It's not a blanket rule for every business or organization. That's just something that is in place within Dalhousie, and actually in a lot of places have that same sort of rule, but that's just an example. So the selection is made and then onboarding begins. And onboarding is when you fill out your tax paperwork, they process your social insurance number, sometimes they'll require a driving abstract. Employers can ask to do a lot will ask for like a criminal background check. Every place that I have worked, when they require a criminal background check, the company pays for it, but I do know that some will require you to pay for it yourself. But I think most provinces will waive the fee for jobs, but I'm not sure. And the other thing that is often required during onboarding is, I shouldn't say often, but some will ask to run a credit check. You can say no. You don't have to allow them to run a credit check. And I know that was something that my previous employer would do, and I had a applicant who was in the process of rebuilding their credit, and they didn't want it to be, hit that ding on their credit, because there's a ding every time you check your credit score. It's really small, and you can usually get it back to where it was before without too much trouble. But anyway, they didn't want to have that run, and so I said, okay. I contacted my HR rep, and I said they're refusing to have their credit run, but they've run everything else, and it was fine. I was able to get the hire through. Personally, I don't understand why someone's credit would matter. We're not loaning them anything, we're hiring them, so why would that matter? But it is something that some employers will ask for during that onboarding process. Now, during the onboarding, there might also be WMIS training, depending on the job position. You might have to complete your WMIS certificate. Maybe you might have to complete your first aid certificate. If the company has a web training system, that would all occur during the onboarding. So you're doing training, but it's not job specific training. That's all kind of lumped in to the onboarding. And then once you're on board, the real training begins.